Anselm Franke is the head of the Department of Visual Arts and Film at the House of World Culture, or the House in Berlin, where he's curated numerous exhibitions. Some of his recent co-curated projects include Neolithic Childhood, Art in a False Present, circa 1930, Parapolitics, Cultural Freedom and the Cold War, Two or Three Tigers, amongst many others. Research over a number of years and built in collaboration with curators, writers, wanderers, artists and philosophers. Anselm's work interacts between visual arts, politics, philosophy, ethnology, psychology, and the natural sciences. His exhibition project Animism, for instance, was shown from 2010 until 2014 with various partners around the world. He was also the chief curator of the Taipei Biennale in 2012 and the Shanghai Biennale in 2014. And many of these projects also feature under Canon Fragen, a series of research-based exhibitions initiated by the House from 2016 to 2020 that grapple critically with the canonization of modernity. Provocatively even asking, is Eurocentrism overcome when art collections are globalized and expanded by what was previously excluded? I think this is a question that resonates very much also with the work we do at the Singapore Art Museum and the National Gallery Singapore. And secondly, but not least, we have the wonderful Ho Tzu Nyen. Tzu Nyen's artistic work is premised on a complex set of references. He often harnesses film, video, performance, writing, and installation in his artistic and theater productions. His richly layered and technically challenging works weave together facts and myths to mobilize different understandings of Asia's history, politics, and belief systems. He's held solo exhibitions internationally, and his works have been featured in very major group shows as well. Anselm's exhibition, Two or Three Tigers, which he co-curated with Hyun Jin Kim, was titled after a multimodal installation by Tzu Nyen that restages an 1885 engraving that records the meeting of the colonial surveyor G.D. Coleman, who also happened to have built numerous public buildings in Singapore, and a Malayan tiger in the jungles of Singapore. The image is a curious one. Coleman is accompanied by a body of convict laborers when he and his entourage are surprised by a tiger, which seems bent on attacking not the humans, but the theodolite, which is the machine used for the survey. Tzu Nyen's ongoing magnum opus, if I may describe it as such, is the Critical Dictionary of Southeast Asia, which he started in 2014, which is an online database of text, music, and images that provides an alternative A to Z of Southeast Asia. And several of his projects are often offshoots or elaborations of this dictionary. And last year, Tzu Nyen co-curated the Asian Art Biennale in Taichung with artist Hsu Chia-wei, and this was titled Strangers from Beyond the Mountain and the Sea. So welcome, gentlemen, and perhaps I can begin with my first question to Anselm. I want to sort of maybe stay with your methods. Both of you, in fact, often take on rather opaque philosophical questions in your projects that are researched over a number of years and eventually resulting in these sprawling sites, for thinking, collaboration, reflection, and even action. Anselm, maybe I wanted to start by asking you to describe a little bit about the Canon Fragen project. Because as I understand it, it concluded this year, or was it last year? And you could share a bit more. And I'm particularly interested in how the project was initiated at the House, and how also it enabled the House to adapt and develop certain methods and tools of self-reflexivity in the way it goes about creating and generating exhibitions, but also dialogues. So, Anselm, please.
Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you, everybody, for having me. You know, the Haus der Kulturen der Welt is an institution with several branches, not physically, but we have, of course, a music department, we have a literature department, and all in all 4 to 5 departments, if you count the cultural education communication department in. And that means, you know, it's not a place, it's not a museum, it's not a place where a certain sort of purification that we know from art institutions is really a given, right? It's also, the building is used as a former Congress hall and really a monument to the Cold War, a gift by the American Congress to the city of Berlin in a time when the East was much more rapidly reconstructing and developing right after the war. So it is a kind of modernist symbol of free speech, etc. But it's a Congress hall, it's not a museum. So in the past few years, when we were beginning to do work at the institution that was really involving all the departments in different measures, I started feeling after a couple of years of a rather successful and challenging program, like, you know, dealing with these questions like the Anthropocene, dealing with difficult questions, also regarding, you know, historical memory. I started feeling that what is needed in an institution like this right now is that we also put a special emphasis on sort of art history, right? Because art, if you have only themed projects, art also can easily slide into a kind of subservient role of having to just, you know, be relevant to the topics that you deal with. And although, you know, many people, because my projects or the projects I'm engaged with are often very sort of thematically complex, many people think maybe that anyway that's the role of art in these projects, but I don't think that at all. I would insist that there is a relatively, you know, there is something like an aesthetic discourse there where it's not just discourse subordinating art. So Kanonfragen was really about how is the house as an institution positioning itself in a field that is tangential to museums, but has the liberty of not having a collection, right? It's a deficit and a gift. And really also, you know, a perceived crisis, both of the institution, you mentioned the kind of problem or the potential problem with the all-inclusive expansive model, wherein, of course, you know, in the end, it's a particular form of a particular conception that is now being universalized of art that is being expanded here. And so I wanted to reflect on that. I wanted to give an institutional platform to a kind of possibility to reimagine modernism, to reimagine the 20th century, and in very broad lines, not to talk too long here, also very broad lines. I mean, the 2 major projects for me were really parapolitics on the one hand, dealing with the post-war period, and what the post-war period, meaning post-45, the sort of reassessment and rehabilitation of modernist art and the modernist avant-gardes, what really that had done to the pre-war avant-garde, so to have the heroic phase of the modernist avant-garde. So first half of this century, that was really the exhibition Neolithic Childhood, that focused around one particular critic and writer who really wrote the first canonization of what we now know as the canon of modernism, right? Like Picasso and what you have. In the year 1926, he wrote it for a kind of series, an art historical series, very popular in bourgeois circles worldwide back then, called the Propylaean Art History. So he canonized modernism in 1926, but he was also a real, you know, a very particular kind of anti-academic figure who would make us remember that modernism is really a product of a foundational crisis of Western knowledge, Western disciplines of knowledge, Western so-called civilization, at the height or at the beyond the apex of its imperial powers. Yeah? Like, so the early 20th century saw a foundational crisis at the heart of physics, at the heart of math, at the heart of all kind of other knowledges involving, you know, logic. The stability of the entire and ethnographic knowledge played a relatively important role in that as well, and therefore also for the avant-garde, right? So the depth of that foundational crisis, the basic premise has been sort of covered up by the rehabilitation of modernism after the Second World War. And Germany, of course, is a particular note of that, not only because the attack against modern art was leveled here like nowhere else. It was leveled elsewhere as well, but nowhere as here, and not as bloody and with the similar consequences. So that in a way, this kind of mythology that you now see in institutions like Documenta, but really in all German art museums, is something that is very much tied to what was taken across this node, right? Like the Second World War, and how was something that was profoundly anti-bourgeois, namely the modernist avant-garde, became the emblem of Western bourgeois culture in its mission to rescue itself after its collapse. Yeah? So that was basically the main storyline of Kanonfragen.
And so has the project in a sense ended? Because you were mentioning this some time ago. Or is this something that will continue?
I mean, we were lucky enough to receive a kind of funding frame that allowed us to work in the frame of like 3, 4, 5 year long sort of projects, and that was one of them. So the project as such, because the funding scheme has ended with the Hubert Fichte exhibition last year. The question, I will continue to work on that, no? But the frame of the project as such, unfortunately, has ended. So we would need to find new ways of framing the upcoming projects.
I want to maybe return to a couple of points you mentioned, but perhaps a little later, as we weave in some of the conversations that both you and Tzu Nyen have been having over the years as well. And so, if I may sort of turn to Tzu Nyen. So I want to maybe invite you to speak a little bit about the dictionary. As also yet another kind of expansive, if I may call it a sprawling project, where you from time to time would add in different terms or phrases, and then eventually kind of branch out, right? Could you talk a little bit more and perhaps also tell us about how it came about? Because it also came about at a very interesting moment, right? Because you moved to Berlin and so on and so forth, which is also the time when these conversations, I suppose, with Anselm begin, I think. Yeah. So.
Sure. Yeah. Well, on the dictionary, I guess at a personal level, I started thinking about the main question of the dictionary, which is essentially, what is this entity, Southeast Asia? I mean, that's kind of like the basic question. I would say it began when I was actually doing my master's. I was doing my master's in the Southeast Asian Studies program at the National University of Singapore. So the question, what is Southeast Asia? In some ways, I would say it's an entry-level question. You know? And but although it is an entry-level question, it has a very complicated answer. You know, the term Southeast Asia probably sort of entered into circulation and became popular with the war. So prior to that, I think people from the region never thought about themselves as being Southeast Asians. So there was, I think, Lord Mountbatten from the Allied Forces. He was running a strategic group, which was the Southeast Asian Command, which was meant to take over Southeast Asia from the Axis powers, mainly to free or to liberate Southeast Asia from the Japanese. So in a sense, for me, Southeast Asia is something that is constructed, but of course, after decades has passed, it has also taken on a certain reality of its own. So I would say that with the critical dictionary of Southeast Asia, it's for me a way to use this object, which is at once real and unreal and constructed, as a way to generate ideas. So, so you mentioned earlier that the dictionary consists of A to Z, like basically 26 terms, which are for me 26 different possible ways to reimagine Southeast Asia. So under T, it's T for tiger, and that's basically kind of how I first met Anselm. If I can recall, I think we met each other after the performance of one of my theater pieces, 10,000 Tigers in Vienna. That's so right. Yeah, and right at the meeting, I think Anselm also offered to work on something together with me, which turned out to be 2 or 3 Tigers, which was the exhibition at the HKW. And sort of coincidentally, at that time, I was in the midst of moving to Berlin to do the DAAD residency. So, all of these things for me kind of formed the constellation of like my Berlin experience. So right before I moved to Berlin, I kind of had this sense that this exhibition that I would do with Anselm and Yeonjin Kim would kind of be like the tail end of my stay in Berlin. So just to get a little bit more into the dictionary, it's the 26 terms that it consists of. They come from various disciplines and fields. So under T, we have T for tigers. Under L, it's L for Leitik, and Leitik is the triple agent leader of the Malayan Communist Party from 1939 to 1947. And coincidentally, I made my first work about Leitik, The Nameless, also for an exhibition that Anselm was curating, which was the Shanghai Biennale. And well, the work was eventually not shown at the Biennale because it was censored for various reasons. So for example, another term in the dictionary is under H, it's H for humidity. So also a way to think about the climate, like in Southeast Asia, and to think about the role of water in Southeast Asia. So they are really a very heterogeneous mix of elements. And the dictionary is a kind of a structure that allows all these different heterogeneous elements to coexist. But at the same time, I think what gradually unfolded was that resonances began to develop between each of these different terms. So for me, the dictionary is, really in some sense, my notebook, or kind of a diagram of like all these different projects that I want to try to make. And in a way, it allows me to think about their interrelation and the resonances between them. So it's also quite an open-ended structure. So you mentioned that the dictionary is a website. So the website is one of its forms. So for the website, I collaborated with 2 German artists, programmers, Sebastian Lugert, and basically we created an algorithmic system that rearranges footage that were gleaned from online sources. And this algorithm recombines this footage according to the concepts that I set out in the 26 terms of the dictionary. So that's one way in which I was trying to think about the dictionary as a whole. So rather than just thinking about specific terms, I wanted to sort of create a platform to see how each of these individual terms can relate and resonate. So I would say perhaps it's a sort of more synthetic sort of a mode, right, of thinking these separate threads that run through the dictionary.
Thank you. And I'm sort of perhaps reflecting on what both of you have just said, right? And in a sense, is also about applying pressure, right, on received knowledge, but at the same time unraveling a whole series of lesser known histories as a result of that very long, rigorous sort of a process. And since this has been mentioned, I thought perhaps it will be interesting to discuss it further, especially the 2 or 3 Tigers project, because I followed it very closely as well. And it was an interesting sort of collaboration, right, between the curators and the artists, because on the one hand, of course, you know, there was this question of meditating on lesser known histories whilst grappling with received narratives, often mediated by the state, by different kind of non-governmental actors, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it also meditates upon the dematerialization of art itself, right? In an age of kind of computer-generated algorithmic kind of rhythms and cycles. So I'm thinking perhaps we can hear from Anselm about what were some of the bigger concerns that the project was also trying to generate. Because again, this was also unfolding at the house, right? So it was in Berlin, but really thinking through so many large cosmological questions as well. So Anselm, do you want to maybe talk about this first, and then we can go to Tzu Nyen?
Yeah, I mean, there was, what we didn't mention until now is that the 2 or 3 Tigers also had a kind of an earlier chapter in the ACC in Guangzhou.
Okay.
That was actually named after the lithograph on which Hsu based his whole Tiger series, right? The one that you mentioned that also was displayed in the museum.
So road surveying interrupted.
Exactly. So I just twisted it a tiny bit and called the entire exhibition, that was in a way meant to open the ACC exhibition department, but because of multiple factors, you know, not in the way that it was initially envisioned, was titled Interrupted Survey. Because that title, I mean, the lithograph itself, much in the same way that Tzu Nyen is using it, obviously is a kind of mythological scene or a primal scene, no? A kind of Urscene, a kind of, it depicts something after which the world will never have been the same. It depicts something that we might not even know how to remember what was before. It is also depicting something that repeats at every moment currently, but repeats now not only with instruments such as the one depicted there, the land surveying tool called the theodolite, but now, you know, happens on the level of satellites, data mining, and deep sensing, and what you have, right? Like, so the image in itself is a cosmological scene, one in which cosmology, nature, technology, and human agents are displayed in a violent encounter, but also in a kind of rupture, in a moment of conflict. So it depicts this coming into being of modernity, of colonial modernity. It is the colonial frontier, right? It's the clearing of the wilderness to make space for, in this case, plantation economy, which is, of course, the matrix of the modern capitalist economy, the plantation economy. But it's also that survey, that clearing, that act of opening up, interrupted, yeah, because of that boomerang effect. And boomerang effects are something that I think in the historiography of colonial modernity are of great importance. Just think of something like Aimé Césaire, the crucial, one of the, next to Fanon and W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the crucial theorists of anti-colonialism and the Black radical tradition, who speaks of the boomerang effect, much like, by the way, Hannah Arendt does, as basically the inevitable return of colonial violence into the colonial center, by which it just means that, you know, nothing stays the same, right? The center will be transformed, but has already transformed, also psychologically, etc. So, so we have another boomerang scene here, because obviously that very nature that is being tamed, pushed back, etc., is sort of jumping back at the very means, the very avant-garde of the frontier. So for me, that is therefore such a fertile ground to understand, you know, somehow our frontier conditions today, or simply ask the question of where, if this frontier is basically is somehow the condition that we inhabit in permanently transformed ways. Now, like, how do we locate ourselves in there? How do we understand our own sociality as part of it? And also, what do we think of art and aesthetics in relation to it? Of course, the cosmological question is inevitably somehow, if you are not buying into the modern version of art history, which from a sort of historically informed non-Western perspective anyway, one cannot easily buy into, right? Because the modernization of the arts is, of course, not simply a universal process. Art cannot be possibly disconnected from cosmology. In Western European art history, a towering figure, I'm just bringing this up because I'm working on it right now. We are opening a show on Abi Warburg next week. And it just became so clear to me, like that, you know, if there's something really great about Abi Warburg, is how he's, first of all, how he rejects the kind of traditional, which is relatively new back then, right? Like, in fact, only 2 or 3 decades, art history, because it looks at its subject matter in these aesthetic terms, in terms of style, in terms of form, and not in terms of cosmological questions. So Warburg brings the cosmos back into art history, and therefore struggles a lot with all the disciplinary, what he calls border police and the transgression of disciplines, etc. But he also, of course, doesn't really, because he's a conservative critique, after all, he doesn't really manage to bring the present from which he speaks, you know, like such as the First World War, into a relation with the historical subject matter, which is like, how is the cosmological question carried on in art? You know, the cosmological question as a question of both the formation of the individual psyche and of the social bond, yeah, of that which, of the medium through which we make societies. So that's basically the larger, you know, sort of question, why this set of questions, this cosmology in that sense is also maybe a word that could replace another very fashionable term, which I became more and more skeptical of in art discourse, which is ontology. And cosmology, you know, like I'm teaching in Geneva, and there's this amazing research center known I guess quite globally called CERN, the particle accelerator. It's this place where some people fear the apocalypse has been forged, the collapse of the cosmos. And you have like an amazing statue in front of the entrance of CERN, gifted by the state of India, like you know, the kind of famous Shiva motive of the cosmological circle of creation and destruction. So you have exactly this conflict field of modern notions of cosmology and what is, you know, scientifically then referred to as, you know, anthropological notions of cosmology, yeah? Their cosmology as a category of belief, etc. But of course, in, you know, powerful art like such as Ho Tzu Nyen's makes us aware that you cannot possibly contain these cosmological questions in the mold of you know, aesthetics, anthropology, etc. Right? Like they concern who we are, how we feel, how we live together, and they're economic. It's an economic question.
And I think more than ever, a lot of these questions are kind of rising up and being discussed really at a mass level, right? In terms of the kind of effects, right, that we have to also live with within the mundane, right, and everyday life. So on the one hand, there is a kind of an appeal to the universal, but at the same time, the universal is guided by one's everyday experience, right, in the world and of the world. And I perhaps I want to ask Tzu Nyen to talk about one particular aspect of 2 or 3 Tigers, which you picked up on, which is on the history of labor, right, and migration. So, for instance, in the image, in the engraving, there is, of course, the archetypal colonial figure, and then there is the beast that emerges from the jungles. But it's also what surrounds these 2 beings, right? The convict labor, right, around which so many things are built as well. Tzu Nyen, could you talk perhaps a little bit about this? Because migration and migrant workers are also very much you know, part of this everyday reality that we're dealing with at the moment in Singapore.
Sure. Yeah, so just to go back to the prints, so Mustafa has already laid out the main elements in the prints. So you have the tiger emerging from one side. You have the colonial surveyor sort of recoiling on the other side. And in the center of the image is the theodolites, which is the instrument, sort of in the midst of falling. So all of these interruptions is kind of suspended, you know, and the beautiful thing about the suspension is that it allows us, it's almost like a slow motion view into all the elements. And usually I think a lot of discussions of the prints ends there, you know, ends between this, I would say this binary clash between the white surveyor and this animal, this, you know, this king of the jungle, the tiger. So I would say that my first interest in the image was also in this binary clash, right? So I began thinking that in the Malay cosmology, actually in the Southeast Asian cosmology, a tiger is not merely a tiger is also a medium. A tiger is a medium for ancestral spirits, you know. So at some point I started thinking that there was this profound ambiguity in the image, which is that the tiger that leaps out is both an animal, but also possibly a were-tiger, like a human tiger. So that was kind of my first, you know, sort of entry into the image. So the project that I did with Anselm, actually, it kind of came in 2 parts. The first part of the project that I did was 2 or 3 tigers. And this was basically 2 screens where we had the tiger and the surveyor sort of singing a duet. So it was really this kind of binary clash. And I was hoping through the project to kind of sort of open up this binary reading. But when I was doing the second part of the project with Anselm in Berlin, and this is what eventually ended up as one or several tigers, I began to be interested in the figures that are most easily ignored, which are all the rest of the figures that were helping George Dromgold Coleman through the jungle. So I began researching who these figures were. And so basically they were all prison laborers, right? So the British sort of quite famously, they sort of abolished slavery, but they replaced the labor economy of slavery with prisoners, many of them from Indian prisons. And actually, they began to send all of these prisoners to their various colonial possessions to serve basically as sort of low wage or cheap labor. So very interestingly, George Dromgold Coleman, the road surveyor, he was probably Singapore's first urban planner and sort of public architect, right? Like, so many of the foundations of his buildings that he had a hand in still exist around the National Gallery area. So we also have a street called Coleman Street, right? Which is like which is right next to the National Gallery. But interestingly, what I wanted to say was that this urban planner who's in charge of public works, he was also simultaneously the supervisor of prisons, you know. And even after Coleman, his various successors would take on these two roles simultaneously. Whoever was in charge of public works was also in charge of running the prisons. And this is for a very pragmatic reason, which is that all of these public works were built essentially by the prisoners, you know. And I would say that the prison system in Singapore began to be seen in some quarters as a very sort of advanced kind of like experimentation in penal systems, in prison systems. So they had this ideal to create a prison where you no longer needed any warders, you know, you don't need any wardens, because the prisoners would be surveying each other. And like a good prisoner, you know, who behaves well would get promoted to become a, you know, prison warden. So it's absolutely efficient system, you know. And not only were they at building buildings, you know, helping to build the buildings that people like Coleman designed, they started even, I think, at some point, learning how to make bricks. So they would produce even the bricks to build the buildings. And it was this quite interesting kind of like economy that was built around that, right? And I would say in many sense, for me, looking into these prisoners became a way to get out of this sort of binary kind of like clash. And it also opened up a different way of like thinking about Singapore, which is, of course, in Singapore now, most of our buildings are built by migrants labor. For example, from like South Asia, you know. So I would say that there's a certain correlation between this, our current economy, which is addicted to these foreign labor. You know, our economic system runs on these addictions, I would say. And I would say this is kind of, in some sense, a legacy from that colonial moment. So of course, you know, recently, I would say, you know, infrastructure is something quite interesting. Like you know, all of us experience it directly, but we seldom think about it until something happens. And that something which happened was basically the pandemic, you know. So with the pandemic in Singapore, you know, the migrant workers are the sort of face the main brunt of these crises, right? So this was the moment where I think sort of a lot of Singaporeans became kind of like conscious of like how our economy is built on these forms of labor.
And since both of you have sort of mentioned these questions of economies, of work and labor, but also generally thinking, I want to perhaps maybe offer some thoughts on what's happening right around us at this moment in time, in COVID times, I suppose, or the COVID present, as we may call it that. And I know we're in the sort of midst of it, and sometimes making sense of it can be a little bit unnerving and challenging, or even confusing, I suppose, which are all, I think, very valid responses to what's happening. But I also feel that there is a strange sense of transparency right now, because everything seems to be unfolding in front of us, but on the ubiquitous digital screen, right? Just as we are seated here right now, right? Bridging space-time. But it has also led to this radical transparency has also strangely enabled all sorts of paradoxes to operate in everyday life. And I'm thinking perhaps I could ask both of you, whoever wants to go first, to maybe offer some thoughts based on your work also, right? And the things that we've discussed, like how do you both think the human perception is being challenged at this moment in time, or is it not being challenged? Any thoughts on this?
You want to go first?
Yeah, I'll try. Yeah, I think it's been interesting, I guess, for us to be kind of locked up, you know, and where our access to the world is kind of channeled through this substitute window, which is essentially the screen. And just like what I mentioned earlier about how, you know, when you have a crisis and our usual habits are kind of broken, you start to feel like the infrastructure, you know, which is usually kind of like invisible. So I think we feel, you know, with the screen culture, we also start to really feel like sort of the algorithms sort of at work, right? Like, for example, if you were watching like catching up on news on YouTube and what the algorithms will kind of select for you next, right? So I think it's just an intensification of things that we have been feeling sort of like all of these years. And you know, what I think is really interesting though is that when we are encountering screens and images on screens, we are encountering like different scales of time. You know, that's kind of like the way I would think about it. There is the time of, for example, the news clip that is unfolding, but there's also all of these micro time, which is the time of the algorithms or the machine time that is beyond human perception. You know, it's we can't perceive time at those scales. But all of these multiple sort of layers of time seem to be kind of like operating, you know, when we are sort of like engaged in this kind of like contemporary screen culture. So I think, you know, part of my curiosity, like in these few months, was kind of like thinking about these multiple scales of time and this kind of like microscopic time. And even though these types of times are below the level of our human perception, I am of the opinion that we still feel them somehow, you know. And I would say that we feel these different levels of time, perhaps the same way that we feel the climate, you know, maybe like humidity, you know, we might not be conscious of it, but at the same time, we feel it a lot of the times. Like, so perhaps one way to think about these types of feelings actually is to differentiate it between perception, which is what we can perceive, and sort of sensations, which is, you know, maybe below the level of perception. And in some ways, I think these kind of sensations, like thinking about these types of sensations, make us think about maybe media as a certain kind of environment, you know. So we are feeling media as this environment which sort of like envelopes and permeates us. And it's sometimes difficult to think about what envelopes us because we are enveloped in it.
Anselm? Oh,
yeah, I mean,
maybe we can come back to what Tzu Nyen also mentioned. Yeah, Anselm, please.
No, I think the idea, like this kind of intensification in perceiving how the envelope is, you know, like the role that algorithms play in forming them is important, I think. I mean, or at least I also contemplate that, and I've never had this experience before, no? Like, not to that degree, also because I was rarely, I'm not someone who consumes this stuff that is prepared by the algorithm a lot, but now I started to do it much more simply, like, you know, just news, etc. Right? So, and this is quite unnerving, actually, as an experience, simply because, of course, you know, not only because of the smartness of the algorithm, or sometimes it's total stupidity, or once the inadequacy of having to measure it in these terms, smart or stupid. But because there's somehow there are two dimensions there that I find are completely out of grasp, at least in my own understanding, no? Like of, you know, out of grasp of a public discussion of political measures, etc. And one is to do with more with the mimetic drifts, and the other one I would, you know, just for the sake of being in this universe right now, no, in Warburg's universe, Warburg's whole entire cultural theory, which is, you know, that of a you know, a Jewish German experience of colonial modernity as an ultra privileged figure who is also perceiving an existential threat in a drift towards fascism. No? And so yesterday night I found that in fact Warburg has, because I was looking for this like for a long time and couldn't find, like, well, did he actually say something about fascism? Okay, he died 3 years before German fascism was on the rise, but so yes, I found that he actually, so the entire theory of Warburg is based on this kind of putting, you know, symbols help us to put the world at a distance, right? So, and rituals are a part of renewing that sort of liminal space in which we have certain symbolic devices to keep the world at bay, right? And in this space, thus opened, contemplation takes place, the rational construction takes place, but also this endless circulation between embodied affect and processes of abstraction. No? So affect, embodiment, abstraction, rationalization. There is a colonial, there's a critique of the coloniality of that model itself that one could go into. Like many other white men at the time that Warburg was writing, his sort of baseline anthropology is based on existential fear. Like fear is the primal emotion. How to master fear is how we self-humanize, how we become human. And that in itself, of course, is probably a colonial frontier, patriarchal colonial frontier phantasm. Not that fear isn't existential, who would negate that, but to build your entire universe on it, a different question. So now Warburg fears that modern technological society collapses that distance, but in particular fascist aesthetics, like the lure of fascist aesthetics destroys the very distance upon which civilization rests. So, and that seems to me still a very interesting thought, like, because what these algorithms do is it's not that they totally destroy the distance, right? But they add another layer to the distance that is not that we cannot even perceive, right? It's so what that means, and putting that in the context of fascism, and I do it obviously with a certain tendency or purpose, because it sets a drift into motion, no, in terms of the entire part that, let's say, we call not the economy as such, but the desire economy, with its immediacies, with its affects, with its mimetic economy, etc. That is put on a different footing right now. No? So perhaps what for Warburg and all these other fear-based anthropologists was once, their fiction of nature, their fiction of a state of nature, for us becomes that algorithmic thing. Like we have to, like, to put it in funny words, we have to train it like a pet, right? But perhaps the symbolic devices, the sort of originary moments of symbolization have to match up an entirely different challenge in the future or in the present. If it's for Warburg, it's like basically sort of fairy tale like animals or monsters, that function as these powerful devices of the imaginary to keep the world at bay and to organize memory and to organize a membrane of liminality between us and everything else, like tigers or snakes or what you have, wolves, etc., etc. So we are facing maybe a similar challenge now with regards to the algorithmic environment.
I just want to also call out to the audience. If you have questions, please do submit them so we can channel them to the speakers. And whilst the questions are coming in, perhaps I can also ask both of you, picking up on some of the issues that you've already raised. Are there any particular projects that you're currently developing at this moment in time, especially since we're rediscovering domesticity in new and renewed ways? We're also rediscovering architecture. Matter is literally being reorganized around us. And I'm also thinking that newer kind of institutions may emerge out of this, right? So newer methods of doing things. But perhaps we can begin with any immediate projects that you're working on. Tzu Nyen, you want to go first?
Yeah. I mean, during this period, I was working on projects that already were begun sort of in the pre-COVID moment, But of course, working on them during these, times sort of had sort of an interesting effect on some of these works that I was doing. I think while we were locked up and being fed this algorithmic sort of barriers of and streams of images, certain events kind of like stood out for me. I mean, I would say that after the first wave of all of these questions and fears about the pandemic, came these riots in the States. And then I think also came a lot of news about sort of trouble in the Asia Pacific, basically between the Chinese and the American. And, while these news were sort of like flowing in, I was working on a project which I already began some years ago, which revolves around a group of Japanese philosophers known as the Kyoto School philosophers. And just as a side note, like my first encounter with the Kyoto School philosophers was actually also in the show Two or Three Tigers, through the work of Park Chang-kyung. So since encountering Chang-kyung's work and this Kyoto School philosophers, it left quite a deep sort of impression on me. And I would say I was part of the reason why I was doing these projects revolving around the Kyoto School was as a way to understand why I am interested in this group of philosophers in mid-20th century Japan, right? So just to give a very quick sort of like summary, the Kyoto School of Philosophers, the founder of the Kyoto School is a person called Nishida Kitaro. And he has this loose constellation of like colleagues and students whom we now think of as the Kyoto School. And in 1942, actually at the end of 1941 to 42, they started a series of 3 round tables. This was the second generation of the Kyoto School, meaning they were students of Nishida Kitaro. And they began, basically it was this 3 philosophers and 1 historian thinking about Japan's world historical sort of beauty at that time, because that was the moment when Japan was starting its sort of like invasions in China, and it had also defeated the Russians in a sea battle. So for the group of philosophers, they saw it as like a break in the world order, that something new was emerging, and that it was Japan's world historical duty to kind of like live up to this shift. And they basically regarded this struggle as a change in world order, as a struggle against what they call the Anglo-Saxon order. So they kind of saw Japan's role as sort of leading Asia against colonization. So working on that project now with what is happening between China and the US, I would say, I would perhaps borrow the term from the Kyoto School, which is between China and the Anglo-Saxon order now, which we can also think about, for example, the Five Eyes Alliance, which is this surveillance sort of spy network between these various countries that have, this Anglo sort of Saxon roots, right? It's one has this feeling of like kind of history sort of repeating itself in the Asia Pacific, right? So that was kind of an interesting moment for me. Yeah.
Thank you. We also have a question here, which is, do you think the arts sector will look the same in 5 years? The social concerns change and new technologies emerge. I'm going to ask Anselm this question because Tzu Nyen is holding on to his dear chest. Yeah. But Anselm, we do also want to hear about what you're working on at the moment.
Yeah, maybe I just try to answer the question in the same stroke. I don't know, I would have to ask an oracle And which one would be appropriate? Which one would be most appropriate? My sense is that, you know, we are seriously seeing the end of times for the so-called art world, because the premises on which it has been built and globalized in the last decades are simply falling apart. And by that I don't mean the money, because obviously those who have provided the cash mostly, which means the 1% globally in the last decades again, are getting richer and richer. So there will be some form of art world attached to their needs and fancies. But everything else connected with the art world is simply falling apart. And that is the liberal order. And the liberal order where capitalist liberalism, economic liberalism, was tied to or believed to be to a certain degree equal to democratic liberalism. And art as a prime form of expression of the liberal subject already since the beginning of its modernization, say after the French and English revolutions, being a kind of paradigmatic expression of that liberalized individual, of the self, you know, juridically stabilized, self-possessed, nationally tinged interiority of the liberal subject. That old liberal order and the new liberal order, the one of the whatever post you want to choose, depending on your location in empire, say post 89, the belief that art by itself is a democratizing force, a liberalizing force. These ideological constructions, however pleasant and forceful they once were, are no longer. You know, they don't hold. So for institutions, the consequences for institutions that rely on that liberal consensus, you know, the narratives, the historical narratives that supported this liberal consensus are not able to reactivate it, right? And it's sliding away. So the consequences will be grave. And I have no idea yet how to phrase exactly what that means, no? But I know that we need to live up to it and get rid of the illusions or the you know, like make sure that we are not sticking to something that has outlived itself, because we'll soon otherwise find ourselves as the liberal fig leaves in a fascist society. And of course, every fascist society needs its liberal fig leaves. And this is really something that I think concerns everyone active in the field, like artists, curators, no exception. So yeah, I'm working on an exhibition that is trying to get, it's not an archival, not a historically, in the sense of, you know, it doesn't include a historical narration. It's really about the problem of liberalism in the form of art, in that which is contemporary art and its multiple others, as it is addressed by artists right now. So it's going to be a group exhibition of very diverse, some 25 artists, collectives that I developed together with Kerstin Stackelmeier, which deals with how works of art themselves are, how forms of practices, of artistic life practices are capable of formalizing their own resistance to being capitalized as art right now.
So yeah, it's a tremendous challenge, I think. at so many levels, right? And it permeates across the spectrum. We have another question, which is sort of in two parts, and I'm gonna maybe take one section first. And both of you, I mean, whoever feels can respond to this. How do we approach or understand the experience of the world if considered as a succession or series of phenomenological moments which has changed radically? So I think it's sort of asking what happens to the myth of linear histories and time. I mean, that moment had already passed, but do you think there's going to be a much more radical shift now in this regard?
Maybe I'll jump in here.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So I'm just kind of like a little bit fixated on the word like phenomenological. Right? Like, I mean, I guess in the sort of philosophical context, when we think about phenomenology, it's sort of like the possible kind of like perception of the human, you know. But I think just to try to kind of link it back a little bit to what I mentioned earlier about sort of like my COVID experience with like screens, I was mentioning, you know, all of these time, sort of micro time, you know, time of like different scales that are precisely sort of beyond like human perception, right? So I would say that it's sort of a kind of a post-phenomenology that we are kind of looking at. I think someone who wrote quite interestingly about this that I'm, I guess, sort of quoting a little bit of is Mark Hanson with his book Feed Forward. I think he wrote a little bit about this. So, you know, in many ways, when we think about the algorithms and what is at work in what we can perceive, I also want to link it back to a question that Mustafa, you phrased earlier, which is about transparency and opacity, right? Like, you know, so what looks kind of very transparent to us has this opacity, and the opacity are non-sort of sensible by our normal kind of human faculties. So another way to describe this is that we are kind of living and experiencing black boxes all the time. Right? So I think, you know, I mean, I can only kind of like speak for myself in like how I think about living with these sort of black boxes. I mean, my own curiosity as an artist is like how to work these black boxes, right? How to do something with these black boxes. And it's, I guess, very different from an older mode of ideological critique that we might have in the past. I think in the kind of the modernist moment, for us, critique is almost this unveiling. Like, you know, you could unveil, for example, the apparatus. There's this fantasy of sort of revealing sort of the material sort of truth of this apparatus. But we are now in a very different kind of like technological kind of like mode, right? Where sort of trying to unpack and unveil and to act, we can no longer kind of exhaust this thing by this, with this illusion of like unveiling its apparatus. So for me, the question is like how to channel it, or how to use it, or how to divert it to other kind of like possible uses. And so, you know, that's kind of like, in some ways, I think this brings us back, like maybe just in ending, like to the dictionary. I guess, even though I wasn't thinking about the dictionary at that time in these terms, I guess those were like sort of very small kind of like baby steps in thinking about this question.
Perhaps I'm also mindful of time. So it's almost 5:15, 10:15 in Berlin. No, 11:15 in Berlin. And perhaps a kind of any last kind of reflections, anything you both of you want to share just before we part ways. Anselm?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it seems that this question about linearity or change is something that, if you also think in terms of like the digital condition, also like, I don't know if I'm able to put this very clearly though. It seems to me that linear histories and accumulative histories are, accumulative in the sense of colonial economic narratives as well, right? Like accumulation is good, equals progress. Non-accumulation equals non-modern, equals wastefulness. Like in a kind of almost battalion sense, no? Christopher Brack calls that the tale of two kinds. Yeah? Those who plan ahead and those who live in the moment. If you map the tale of two kinds onto other tales of two kinds, such as circular time versus linear time, and of course they are intimately linked, and look at how this plays out in media history and anthropology, for instance, you find that this distinction is informing all modern accounts of media technology and anthropology. So the relation between technological media and human beings as mediums in their being social mediums, and there's this kind of distinction where the similar set of motives repeats itself on, let's say, the alphabetic culture versus the oral culture, right? The oral culture is circular and based on a different economy of time and non-accumulation than alphabetic culture, etc. And McLuhan also was very obsessed with this question, and towards the end of his life in particular, seeing how, like, first of all, there is a recognition already in the early 20th century with people like Marcel Mauss, etc., that this oral space, or this space of the non-accumulative, where it's necessary to be in a lived encounter and embodied practice, body techniques, etc., lived speech, etc., that this factor never disappears from human life, right? That sort of the accumulative architecture infrastructure is something that only transforms that space, but remains sort of it can never take it completely over, right? But the relationship between the two of them is permanently recalibrated, and that's what the terms of its recalibration right now, and our ability to act on that. This is what I'm trying to think through in larger networks right now, because I think we need to find new modes of action there. No, like it's because as someone like Mark Hanson that Tzu Nyen brought up, it changes really what sense making, both in like sense making in the terms of sense, but also in terms of the sensuality of it, anthropologically mean to us. So I think that, but that is not something that we are only necessarily passive in relation to, and the forms of acting on it are something that I think we need to collectively develop.
Yeah, I guess maybe in ending, I will also once again refer to one of your earlier questions, which was like, what am I sort of like been working on as a way to kind of answer some of these larger questions. So other than this project on the Kyoto School, I also started a project sort of about Korean history, but I wouldn't go into details about the project except the title. So the title of the project is called 49th Hexagram. And the 49th hexagram is one of the 64 hexagrams in the Chinese Book of Changes, or the I Ching Yeah. So I thought it might be interesting to talk about I Ching here, simply because, again, it ties in some sense to what Anselm was mentioning earlier about cosmology, because in many ways, the I Ching is, I think, one of the most condensed expression of a certain Chinese classical cosmological system. But at the same time, the I Ching is, of course, as the translation of the book suggests, right, the book of changes. It is about change and permutations. And it sort of, which kind of brings me back to what we've been speaking of, which is this algorithmic world that we are currently inhabiting, which is kind of about calculations and permutations, right? So when we think about futures or the calculation of futures, this in some sense also links to the question of infrastructure. So like, for example, for states or various big businesses, when a crisis hits, you must immediately think about all the various possible permutations that can happen and how that will affect your business or the state, right? And the ability to calculate permutations is directly tied to like infrastructural power, or what we have today, like computing power, right? So what I'm saying is that it seems that those who are able to calculate, in a strategic sense, permutations, are those to whom the infrastructures, they possess the possible kind of infrastructure to make these calculations, right? So this fits into our sort of like science fiction kind of like visions of supercomputers and how, that would kind of like change everything. But in a way that's already happening, like with Wall Street and their supercomputers, right? So, yeah, I mean, I don't really have like a specific point, that I'm making, but just in kind of thinking about how we are sort of entering and being swept up in this, in the present, into these algorithmic futures. I think for me, the interesting thing is also sometimes to kind of like go back into the past, like into the I Ching, which is, for me, the I Ching is simply a work about all possible permutations as well, right? So, just wanted to kind of end off for myself on this analogy.
Fantastic. Thank you both. I'm looking forward to both laboratories coming up very soon. One as a kind of an art project and the other as an exhibition, and connected, I suppose, through the discussions and dialogues, right? That both of the projects will generate. And I think more than ever, I think if there ever was a call to think about newer ecologies, I think it would be now. So once again, thank you. And thank you to the audience for joining us. And please do keep an eye out for future SAM chat sessions. And yeah, see you soon and take care. Yeah. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.